Now that we've covered effect modification, we've covered most of the more difficult concepts in this course, and so it's going to be comparatively easy from now on. So you have all the key concepts now for understanding an epidemiology publication. So I'm going to talk about the publications themselves, starting with this first talk, the basic structure of basically a scientific paper, but I'm going to really be focusing on epidemiologic publications. Now, some of you will have experience already in preparing manuscripts and getting them published, but others of you will not have done so. At least I say that based on my experience with classes here at Berkeley. And so I really want to go through these things which may be familiar to some of you. So virtually all scientific and medical journals require a fairly common format with some variations, and this really applies in most of public health and epidemiology. So we'll go through these items one by one, starting with the abstract, the introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusions. So the abstract, sometimes referred to as a summary, and usually it ranges between 150 or 300 words, depending on the instructions to authors. So whenever you're starting to prepare a manuscript and you have a particular journal in mind, always refer to the instructions for authors. They can get quite detailed, and invariably they'll tell you what the abstract should consist of. And most abstracts are around 200 to 250 words, but I've seen them as low as 150, and sometimes they allow up to 300. Anyway, the abstract is really the paper in miniature, and increasingly journals are requiring that abstracts be structured. In other words, that they have headings reflecting very much what's in the paper. So you might have a heading for introduction, for methods, results, discussion, conclusions perhaps. So you want to pay a lot of attention to the abstract, because often when you submit a manuscript to a journal, it's the only thing that the editor will read, because they get many manuscripts submitted, and they have to go through a triage process where they basically reject some immediately and others get sent out for peer review. It doesn't guarantee you'll get published, but at least if it does go out for peer review, you will get the benefit of some reviewers' comments. We'll come back to the peer review process. Anyway, the manuscript, or at least the abstract, should state all the key findings, any limitations of the study, and don't shy away from limitations, because every study has limitations, every observational study, and in fact every experimental study for that matter. And if you don't show an awareness of the limitations, then that will really count against you in the decisions about whether or not to publish in a particular journal. So, and you also need to mention the overall implications of the findings, what the study adds to what's already out there in the published literature, and any further work needed. But as I say, pay good attention to the abstract. And not only will the editors may it be the only thing that the editors read in making their decisions, but from the point of view of getting a readership ultimately, you want an abstract to be catchy, because abstracts get published on PubMed, and people make decisions about what they'll read, when they'll read the full manuscript, or the full publication I should say, based largely on the abstract. So every paper, every manuscript has an introduction section, and this shouldn't necessarily be very long, but it should explain the reason why you did the study. And usually that involves saying a little bit about what's already gone before, what's been published, and what the general opinion is out there about the topic that you're studying, and maybe what's not known, and why you're doing this particular study, what it's the purpose of doing it, what it's likely potentially to add to general knowledge about the area, the topic. And usually you should state some specific objectives of your study, or some research hypotheses. And usually in the introduction section, these will become immediately just before the method section, which is the next section. So the method section, of course, states how the study was carried out. It includes a brief description of all the the study design features, the population, the study population, how they were sampled, and how you measured the exposure and the outcome, which may be through a questionnaire, of course, but you need to say something about the questionnaire and what it covered. And you also need to say something about how you went about recruiting participants. How did you sample your participants from a larger pool of potentially eligible people? And basically all the data collection methods. And then you also need to state what the statistical analysis methods were, and if possible provide references to those. In fact, the more you can provide references in the method section, the more you can kind of include in there. The general purpose of a method section is to provide enough detail that the reader could, if necessary, actually kind of replicate the study in another population. Although it's seldom that method sections are that detailed, and unfortunately people often cut back the method sections because invariably there's a word limit for just about any journal, and people often trim back their method sections, unfortunately, because they want to say more about the results and have more discussion. But the method section is extremely important, and you need to include as much detail as you can. If you're lucky and there's been a paper published about your study just dealing with the methods, then you can refer to that. But that's very much a rarity. But however, if there have been other studies published, other publications from the particular study that you're writing about, then you may simply be able to refer to them as containing much fuller explication of the methods, and then that will save some words, and you can use that for your results and discussions. So the next section generally is the results section, and that describes what was found in the data analysis, and you should make sure that it relates to the stated research hypotheses, and also that it relates to the methods, because all these things have to hang together. So if your results section uses some methods that's not in the method section, then you need to go back and put it in there. And tables and figures can be very useful. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as I think the saying goes. And so a figure, maybe a scatter plot, or a regression with a regression line, say, or a bar chart, or whatever, can be very, very useful to the reader. So, and tables too. And always there should be at least one table, and usually it's table number 1, which describes the participants, their basic characteristics. So if it's a case and control study, it would have separate columns for the cases and the controls, and it would set out their basic demographic details, such as the male and female, and the ages. Is separated usually into different age groups, and then you would set out the different exposures. You then set out the different exposures separately for the cases and controls, say, and you would have percentages of the cases which had each of the different exposures. So very important to have at least one table, and usually at least a second table, setting out the key results of the data analysis. And then you should have something in the text of the results, which actually describes preferably something that's not just in the table. So you shouldn't use the text part of the results section just as to restate what's in the tables. Just in the text, just highlight key features that appear in the tables, things that kind of relate to your key study hypotheses. You don't have to restate everything. And it's good to be familiar or have practice in making sure you keep the results section separate from the discussion. So people often, particularly when they're beginning to write epidemiology study papers, find that they include discussion in the results, but they shouldn't be doing that. The results section is intended really just to set out the results of your the data analysis, but it would usually start with something about the participation. You would usually want to put the participation rate, how many people you tried to recruit, and how many people actually ended up participating in the study. That's a very important result. And then from that it would lead on to a basic description from the participation rate, basic description of the study population, leading into the more detailed, possibly multivariate analysis that you do. So, and then that leads into the discussion section, which describes the key findings from the results. Now, you don't want to just restate the results, what you found. You need to stick to the important findings, so that and then you need to go into and talk about the implications of those findings. And you also need to discuss the study limitations. So there may be certain implications of your findings, but invariably there will be limitations. There'll be strengths too, and you can highlight the strengths, maybe a large sample size, or comprehensive adjustment for confounding, or a selection method that avoided selection bias, something like that. All those things are strengths, but invariably there will be some limitations, and often the limitations in epidemiology are around the issue of exposure assessment, because very frequently we use questionnaires, and the questionnaires have potentially all sorts of problems. Well, at least there's a limit to the length of time that you can keep questioning people, so you don't get absolutely everything, and certain inferences need to be drawn from the data that you do collect with your questionnaire. So I always address separately in my publications. I separately address selection bias, information bias, and confounding. So do a separate assessment of each of those, show that the reviewers that you have actually thought about these things, and try and assess the extent to which they are impacting the results of your study, or so you think. And if you set that out, then reviewers will be somewhat happy that you're able to see these things, and you're not overstating the implications of your study. And it's a good thing, once you've talked about selection bias, information bias, and confounding, make some summary statement about the overall direction of any biases on your study results. And then, important to put your own results in the context of what's been found from previous studies. And so relate your results to previous studies, and you can highlight the consistencies and also the differences. So if your result is different to anything that anybody else has found, try and provide a possible explanation for that. Even if it may be quite speculative and you don't know for sure, but basically you can do that by looking at the methods and the study populations in those other studies and comparing it with what you've done, and then setting these things out and just comparing and contrasting if you like. Then state the public health implications of your results, if there are any, and probably most publications don't have any clear public health implications, but sometimes it's the combined result of a number of studies looking at the same thing, maybe finding the same thing, that may be most important. Then you need to say something about whether any additional research is needed. And it's a bit of a cliche to say more research is needed, but really that is the nature of science. We rarely find ourselves in a situation where no more research is needed. Each bit of research opens up another door, and we need to go a bit further to explore. And in any case, even if you seem to have found a clear result, it's often the case that it would be good to have that result confirmed in other settings. So you may say something like, other studies and other settings are needed to confirm the results that we found, or something like that. And then right at the end, have some sort of final concluding paragraph that basically sums up the strengths, the limitations, the implications, and the need for any additional research. So let me just say a little bit about the peer review process before I conclude this talk. And basically the way it is really in all of science, including epidemiology, we send our manuscript formatted according to the author instructions, the author guidelines of the journal. So make sure you pay attention to those, or you'll get a swift rejection. So and go to some trouble to make sure the references are in the right format, and you've got all the right headings and the right font, and so on and so on. And most manuscripts are submitted online these days, and they check that you include various things, and you will upload the manuscript electronically. So when the journal receives it and all the key requirements, the initial requirements have been met, they will make some in-house decision, the editors, and they may actually, and it often happens these days, a journal gets rejected within days. So don't be too discouraged about that. Basically, it means that they've got a lot of publication manuscripts coming in, and that's the case with pretty well any journal these days. So, and they may say, well, it may not be quite within the scope of the topics that we're interested in. It rarely says that a manuscript is of low quality. It's usually because it's not quite within the scope of the things that they're most interested in. So if you get a rejection within a few days, then don't be discouraged. Reformat according to the guidelines of another journal, but try and pick your journal. Maybe talk to colleagues about what would be an appropriate journal to resubmit to, and reformat it and resubmit. Anyway, if you get through that first triage process, then the manuscript will go out to maybe 2 or 3 or 4 reviewers who are regarded as well qualified to give comment on it. And often these are very experienced people, and they may send back a great deal of comment. Don't be discouraged. We all get, sometimes with some of our manuscripts, huge amounts of comments from reviewers. And in many ways that's a good thing, because first of all it means that the reviewer was somewhat interested in what you had to say, and they're giving you some constructive feedback. Hopefully it's constructive. Usually it is. And even if the journal ultimately doesn't accept it, you've had a lot of good feedback for which you should take account of, and revamp your manuscript if it seems appropriate. And it's very rarely the case, very rarely the case, that reviewers will say, well, this manuscript is so good that we don't have to do nothing needs to be done to it. It can be published as is. That's a very rare occurrence. So usually, and quite commonly, you'll get a lot of comments, and the journal will send them to you once they've got all the reviewers' comments in. So, and then you have to revise the manuscript and address the comments, so that the comments may be addressed in a cover letter. What you did, just say that you comment by comment how you responded to it. If you don't agree with the comment, then that's fine, but you need to explain to the editor why you didn't agree with the comment. And it's often the case that reviewers have got the wrong end of the stick, and they're saying things that they've misunderstood something about your study. That may simply be an indication that you really need to kind of revise some of the wording, explain it a bit better if they have misunderstood. But that in itself would be a response. You say that the reviewer seems to have misunderstood that we did such and such, but we've clarified the wording by changing something so that this mistake doesn't arise again. But anyway, the key thing is to be responsive to the reviewers and not to be dismissive. Being dismissive is a dangerous way to go, because the editors would be likely to think that you are arrogant, and it would make them much less sympathetic to your case for publication. So if you get the reviews back and the editor says, well, revise and resubmit, that's a good sign, because usually that means, provided you adequately respond to the reviewers, then your chances of getting published are very good. On the other hand, the editor may receive the reviews from the reviewers, and they may say, well, I don't think that this article is kind of salvageable. Too much is needed, and it would make it it would just be make it such a different manuscript that really we don't think that it would be suitable for this journal. But they'll send you the review comments anyway, so it pays to pay attention to them and maybe revise your manuscript and send it to another journal. But don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged, because we all, even the most experienced epidemiologists, have rejections periodically, and that certainly includes myself. And you just have to kind of get a little hardened to the fact that you will get rejected from time to time, and you're in good company there. And don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged. Take into account any comments that you get, revise it, think about another appropriate journal, and resubmit. And you may end up having to do this several times, and we all have to sometimes do it several times. And that can be particularly the case if you have a finding that's unusual, that's unexpected, because unfortunately journals are a little nervous about findings that kind of go against the prevailing wisdom, the prevailing paradigm, and they can be nervous that maybe there's something wrong with the study, and they're going to get embarrassed. So although we all like to find exciting new results, that is a risk, and because of that, you may have to submit to several journals. And so some of the most important results in public health and medicine have gone through several rejections before they've actually got published. So don't be discouraged. That's the key thing there. Anyway, despite the peer review process, it's generally accepted that published studies, including epidemiology studies, often have major problems, which often don't come to light until very much later. So don't assume when you're reading the literature that just because something has been published in a peer-reviewed and maybe respectable journal, that it's necessarily doesn't have flaws. Because when you become more experienced in studying these things, you'll realize that many published studies, have poor designs, biases that the authors and the reviewers don't seem to have noticed, and inappropriate analyses and missing data and unsubstantiated conclusions, and so on and so on. So the thing is that when you do read published papers, just because it's published and you don't think you have as much experience as the authors, don't assume that it's you who's wrong, and it may be the authors. So always bear that in mind. That's why we need to have a critical approach to reading the epidemiology literature. And this is something that really comes with practice over time, and hopefully during this course you've got a bit of practice with that. Okay, so finally, I want to draw your attention to the strobe statement. So this is a very useful, it's basically several checklists. And STROBE stands for Strengthening the Reporting of Observational Studies in Epidemiology. And if you remember, when we talked about experimental studies, we talked about the consort statement. So this is really the observational epidemiology equivalent of the consort statement. And it has a separate checklist for cohort, case control and cross-sectional studies. And they are very sensible checklists. And basically, so if you're preparing a manuscript, consult, for one of these particular study designs, consult the relevant strobe statement, the relevant strobe checklist, see if you're in kind of including all of the elements of the checklist in your manuscript, and then your chances are increasingly are much greater of being published. And a lot of journals are now endorsing the strobe statement and actually requiring that you make some statement that your publication conforms to the relevant checklist. And I've given you here the website from which you can download the checklists. So not only is this good for these checklists good for your own manuscripts, but also if you have to critique somebody else's publication. Having the strobe statement there for the particular study design is very useful. You can kind of compare the elements that the strobe statement requires, or strongly suggests, I should say, and see if they're actually in the manuscript that you're reviewing. So, all in all, a very useful set of checklists, the strobe statement. Highly recommend it.